In 1990, as the Soviet Union was preparing for its fatal plunge into the free market paradise, Bruce Gelb, who was head of the USIA, told a reporter that the Soviets would benefit from U.S. business education because, quote, the vipers, the bloodsuckers, the middlemen, that's what they need. That's what needs to be rehabilitated in the Soviet Union. That's what makes our kind of country click. Quoted in the Washington Post, Bruce Gelb, one of the leading intellectuals of the Republican Party. The vipers and bloodsuckers have arrived in Russia, Eastern Europe, and China. Consumer goods are more abundant than ever. Thousands of luxury cars are on the streets of cities like Moscow and Prague. Rents and real estate prices have skyrocketed. Stock exchanges have sprung up all over China, Russia, and Eastern Europe. A new class of investors, speculators, and racketeers are wallowing in wealth. And with that accumulation of wealth comes, with the enrichment of the few comes the impoverishment of the many. The professed goal in these countries is no longer to provide a better life for everyone, but to improve opportunities for individuals to pursue personal gain and amass great fortunes. So what has this brought for the many? A dramatic rise in unemployment, homelessness, drug addiction, air and water pollution, tuberculosis, cholera, polio, prostitution, teenage rape, child abuse, and just about every other social ill. Beggars, pimps, dope pushers, and other hustlers ply their trade as never before. In countries like Russia and Hungary, the suicide rate has climbed 50% in a few years. There's been a decline in nutritional levels and a sharp deterioration in health. 1/3 of Russian men now never live to the age of 60. The death rate has risen nearly 20% for East German women in their late 30s, and nearly 30% for men of the same age. In contrast, where communist governments are still in power, Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam, death rates continue to fall, according to that communist publication, the New York Times. That's where I got that one. Prominently displayed on page 24A, on the lower left-hand side in the deep, on the, it was the 26th paragraph of a long article. Occupational safety is now almost non-existent, and workplace injuries and deaths have drastically climbed. In China, there are workers who now put in 12 to 16 hours a day for subsistence pay without regularly getting a day off. The market reforms in China have brought a return of child labor. See, that's why U.S. leaders like China, but they don't like Cuba. You hear these people say, well, we're friends with China, but we're still hostile to Cuba. How irrational. Just because you don't understand the policy, it doesn't mean they don't understand it. The key is the relationship of capital to labor. And in China, labor is being imprisoned. And in China, capital has been unleashed in its rawest, most vicious free market way. And that's not true in Cuba. In Cuba, nobody works 12 to 14 hours a day. In Cuba, the human services haven't been cut back. And that's the problem with Cuba. That's where Cuba still has to reform. In Eastern Europe and Russia, worker vacation resorts, clinics, cultural centers, daycare centers, and other features that used to make communist enterprises something more than just workplaces, they have just all about disappeared. Worker rest homes have been redone as gambling casinos and nightclubs for the nouveau riche. School lunches, which were once free or very low priced, are too costly for many pupils. Hungry children now constitute a serious school problem. After only 1 year of its free market paradise, Russia saw its consumer spending drop almost 40%. Now, just to give you what that means, in the Great Depression, in the first 3 years, it took 3 years, in the first 3 years, consumer spending dropped 21% over 3 years. Now here, in 1 year, you had almost actually more like 38 point something percent. In the former communist countries, 70 to 85%, it varies from country to country, 70 to 85% now live below or not far above the poverty level, many of them in absolute economic desperation. The eastern countries are also, and this may be one of the most significant points, they also are being recolonized by Western capital. The pattern of trade is becoming third world. If you look at third world countries, you find they do very little trade with each other, even right next door. All their economies are geared to the West, extracted from the West. That's exactly what's happening now in Eastern Europe, where there used to be an enormous trade between the various Eastern European and Soviet Union countries. There's very little trade between them now. Almost all of it is with the West. The West has come in and has pretty much taken over. Multinational corporations are moving into Russia to exploit the vast oil, gas, and mineral reserves with enormous profits, and little benefit going to the people. Big private companies will enjoy easy loans, cheap labor, speed-ups, broken labor unions, and no taxes. It's the third world all over again, ladies and gentlemen. U.S. timber interests, with the financial support from a venture fund sponsored by the Pentagon, our tax money, are preparing to clear-cut the Siberian wilderness, a region that holds 1/5 of the planet's forests and is the habitat of rare species. And this is being done over the protests of U.S. and Russian environmentalists. Private investment has brought a decrease rather than an increase in production. Understand that. State enterprises are being driven into bankruptcy as private investment comes in. In the Czech Republic, nearly 80% of all enterprises have been privatized, and most of them have been decapitalized. They've been rubbed out, in effect. Industrial production shrank by 2/3. In Poland, with privatization, production has shrunk about 1/3. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, a labor representative noted, quote, "Privatization seems to mean the destruction of our companies. Macedonians complain about how work has taken over their lives. One has no time to care about others. There's no time even for oneself, only time for work and for making money." That was on the PBS report. Thousands of cooperative farms have been forcibly broken up over the protests of their members. Agricultural output has consequently plummeted in these countries. The new private farmers find they can't produce for a commercial market. They're unable to get loans or seeds or machinery. They're rapidly losing their holdings, or they're reverting to subsistence farming. Hungary's agricultural cooperatives, which by the way was one sector of the socialist economy that performed very well, but with privatization breaking up the cooperatives, farm output has plunged 40%, according to that biased communist publication, the Los Angeles Times. Now that's not stupid. That's not irrational or wasteful. That's the goal. The goal is to decapitalize Eastern industry and agriculture so it doesn't compete on the European market, to turn it into a colonized third world, a cheap labor, a cheap resource region. 1992, the Lithuanian government decreed that former owners and their descendants could reclaim land and other property confiscated during the socialist era. That meant that tens of thousands of farming families, about 70% of the rural population, has been evicted from land that they worked for over half a century, completely destroying the country's agricultural base in the process. In East Germany, much of the industrial and agricultural production was destroyed to prevent competition with heavily subsidized Western firms and farms. East Germans have a very interesting series of complaints that they're making now with unification. They complain that the net flow of money has been from the East to the West in what amounts to the colonization of the East. They complain that the free market is a myth, that the Western economy is fully regulated and rigged against the interests of the East. They complain that West German police are much more brutal than were the East German police. That if West Germany had denazified anywhere near as thoroughly as they're forcing the East to desocialize, they would have had a totally different country. A startling discovery made by citizens from communist countries is the amount of bureaucracy in the West. Soviet immigrants in Canada have complained that, quote, bureaucracy here was even worse than at home, according to an article by Hans Blumenfeld, Monthly Review. East Germans now under West German rule are staggered by the flood of complicated forms they have to fill out for taxes, health insurance, life insurance, unemployment compensation, job retraining, rent subsidies, bank accounts. Because of the kind of personal information they have to give, they feel less privacy than in the GDR, according to a report in Z magazine. In Russia, organized crime now extorts tributes from 80% of all enterprises. Its tentacles reach right into the top echelons of government. Contract murders number in the thousands every year. Street crime has also sharply increased. In Hungary, there's been a 50% increase in murder since the fall of communism. According to the New York Times, the police force in Prague, in the Czech Republic, today is many times greater than it was under communism when relatively few police were needed. Now, isn't that interesting? Very few police in the communist police state. Figure that out. I don't get it. Is there something they're not telling me? There's been a drastic decline in cultural life. Theaters are now sparsely attended because tickets are so prohibitively expensive. Publicly owned movie industries in countries like Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the GDR that occasionally produced some worthwhile films are being defunded or bought out by Western interests, and they're now making cartoons, TV commercials, and music videos. Movie theaters in the Eastern countries are being taken over by Western chains, and they now offer many of the same Hollywood junk films that we have the freedom to see. Subsidies for the arts... Subsidies for the arts and literature have been severely cut. During the communist era, 3 out of every 5 books produced in the world were produced in the Soviet Union, including inexpensive but quality classics and classics and books by contemporary authors from Latin America and Africa and Asia, and poets from all over the world. Today, as the cost of books, periodicals, and newspapers have skyrocketed, today, as education has declined, readership has shrunk almost to third world levels. Books of a Marxist or otherwise critical left perspective have been removed from bookstores and libraries throughout almost all these countries. In East Germany, the Writers Association reported one instance in which 50,000 tons of books, some of them brand new, were buried in a dump after unification. The German officials can't quite get themselves to burn them like in the old days. Education is now accessible only to those who can afford the costly tuition. Curricula have been depoliticized, as they call it, meaning that a left perspective critical of imperialism and capitalism has been replaced by a conservative one. The same thing has happened in the news media. Both public and private media have been purged of leftists and restaffed by persons with acceptable ideological orientations, so that they're almost indistinguishable from our own media. This process of moving toward a pro-capitalist ideological monopoly has been described in the Western media as democratization and reform. There's also been a very sharp increase in gender inequality. The new Russian constitution eliminates provisions that guaranteed women the right to paid maternity leave, prenatal care, job security during pregnancy, affordable daycare centers, and all that. In all communist countries, about 90% of the women had jobs. Today, in the post-communist countries, women compose over 2/3 of the unemployed. Women are being driven from the professions in disproportionate numbers and are now advised against getting professional training. Prostitution is the one booming industry open to enterprising women in the free market, catering to foreign and domestic businessmen. Divorce, abortion, and birth control are more difficult to obtain. The financial and psychological independence that women used to enjoy under socialism is pretty much gone. You see how your own personal psychological independence is in part determined by social structures and social arrangements, what your options are, what your opportunities are, and all that. And that can be destroyed. In Russia, instances of sexual harassment and violence against women have increased sharply, as in the other countries. In Russia, the number of women murdered, primarily by husbands or boyfriends, has skyrocketed from 5,000 to 15,000 in the first 3 years of the free market paradise. For 50,000 a year. An additional 57,000 women were seriously injured in such assaults in 1994. These official figures, they understate the level of violence. The Communist Party committees that used to intervene in cases of domestic abuse no longer exist. Throughout Eastern Europe and Russia, many people now grudgingly, they're admitting that life was better under communism. I mean, that's even grudgingly being reported in the U.S. media. So it must be a lot of people saying this, if I keep hearing it so much, even in the U.S. media. There's a joke that circulated in Russia in 1992, after the first year of the free market paradise, and it went like this. Question: what did capitalism accomplish in 1 year that communism could not do in 70 years? Answer: make communism look good. Reacting to the pain of the free market, people, Eastern European voters, have begun returning communists to power. In Russia too. Bringing them back into power to preside over the ruin and wreckage left by capitalist restoration. Socialism, the system that didn't work, provided everyone with some measure of security. Capitalism, the system that works, has brought a free-falling economy and mass misery. And I don't think, nor are these conditions just part of a temporary transition period. That's what we heard all the time. I remember Tom Brokaw, when he was in Russia, interviewing a guy and saying, well, you know, well, before you can go up, you got to go down. This is some law of physics he just invented, you know. There's a painful transition period that you can work through. In fact, nations can stay a long time in capitalist depression, with vast capital accumulation for the few and poverty for the many. Look at Latin America. And these communist nations, I think, like all so-called developing nations, are likely to remain in poverty indefinitely, so that a privileged few can continue to enjoy unlimited opulence. Well, the people of these eastern countries wanted to be like America, at least a lot of them did, not knowing what America was like. And instead they ended up being more like the capitalist third world, the same direction that capitalist America is being pushed into. They've suffered, by the way, a momentous historical defeat. And the third world struggles have suffered a tremendous defeat because they can no longer get aid from East Germany or Soviet Union. And what do we learn from this? What I learned is that capitalism is not a benign system, brothers and sisters. It goes after everything. It leaves not a social program in place. It leaves not a tree standing. It leaves not a job or a home or a child feeling secure. It is a ruthless, self-devouring system that will take us and the planet down with it if we don't fight back, if we don't rein it in.